Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here with us. I'm Karim Islan. I'm the director of the North Africa Initiatives at the Rafik Hariri Center and the Middle East Programs at the Atlantic Council. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our event, which we have, with some optimism and some pessimism, called Libya, the long road to elections. On the one hand, emphasizing the fact that we are going to have elections, and on the other hand, the fact that it's going to be a long road. So this has been the elephant in the room for the past 2, 3, 4 months in every webinar, in every panel, in every conference we had. So it is important for us to discuss it right in this moment with the timeliness that we need to have, and to do that, to try to shed some light on this important issue. We have invited 4 great speakers, which we will go to introduce them right away. First, we'll have Imad Badi. Imad is a long-time friend, is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He is a senior analyst at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime and an advisor for Libya at the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to have you with us, Imad. Second, we're going to have Mary Fitzgerald. We are really honored to have her with us. She's a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. She has worked on Libya for more than a decade, initially as a journalist. She lived in Libya and Tripoli in 2014. Mary has conducted research on Libya for the International Crisis Group, the United States Institute of Peace, the European Council on Foreign Relations, and the European Institute of the Mediterranean, among others. It's truly a pleasure and an honor to have you with us, Mary. Third, we have Ben Fishman. He's a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Ben served from 2009 to 2013 on the National Security Council, where he held several posts, including Director for North Africa and Jordan, Director for Libya, and Executive Assistant to Ambassador Denis Ross. As Director for Libya, he coordinated U.S. support for Libyan revolution. Ben, it's truly a pleasure. Thank you very much for accepting to join us. And last but not least, definitely, we have Roberta Maggi, a project assistant at DCCAF, Geneva, Center for Security, Sector Governance, Middle East and North Africa Division. Her work focuses on Libya and Yemen. Her research interests include security sector reform, armed group formation, and the politics of reintegration in conflict and post-conflict environments. Thank you very much to you, Roberta, to join us as well. Without much time to waste, I would like to pass immediately the floor to Imad for his initial remarks. Every speaker will have 10 minutes of remarks, and then in the meantime, I will be receiving your questions, and I will put them immediately after the completion of Roberta's talk. We'll just go directly to your questions, and we'll begin the Q&A session. Thank you very much again, and please enjoy what I'm sure will be an extremely interesting panel. Imad?
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, I've been asked to focus my initial remarks basically on the contemporary situation, so to speak. In many ways, it was this catch-22, and we ended up in the current situation because of the scheming of the political elite that is now actually poised to benefit from a crisis that they have de facto manufactured. What we've seen over the past year has essentially been this choreography where known spoilers, I would say, and known spoilers not just for the past 1 or 2 years, but the past almost 10 years, have engaged in this act whereby they essentially portrayed themselves as Democrats. Including, I would say, chief amongst them is the chief spoiler in the past 10 years, Khalifa Haftar himself. And right now, he is the figure, I would say, that is perhaps best poised to benefit in the different scenarios that we might have moving forward. At this stage, speaking to diplomats and to people here in Tripoli over the past week until yesterday, I would say, the main question wasn't what candidates' plans for reforms were, what they were planning to do, etc. It was mainly whether the elections were going to happen at all. And I think that spoke a lot about the how bungled the process was, let's say. I think it was only until yesterday, basically, that it was almost informally decided, let's say, or informally announced that the elections were going to be postponed. For some, it was a sigh of relief. For others, it was a shock. But for the vast majority of the political elite, this is a crisis that they knew was going to happen because they were the ones that manufactured it. They knew that this is where it was going to lead. For some, they were trying to position themselves to benefit from flawed elections. But I would say the percentage of having the probability, sorry, of having those flawed elections was minimal in comparison with the benefits that they could reap from a crisis. And so in the past few weeks, we've seen clear alliances establish themselves to benefit from the legitimacy vacuum that would ensue after the 24th of December. And now we clearly see that there are Libyan political figures and coalitions that are trying to basically poise themselves as alternatives for the GNU, whether it be through a potential handover, whether it be through an HOR endorsement. There are different iterations or permutations of different plans, let's say, that are pitched at the moment. But the main, I would say, the gist of it basically would be to replace the GNU with something else. Effectively, what is holding, I would say, the coalition that currently exists is perhaps similar to the volcano of rage military coalition that existed before that was explicitly anti-Haftar. The current coalition that exists amongst most of the political figures is explicitly anti-GNU-PM, so anti-Dbeiba. They don't have much other than that holds them together. I would say that they're even perhaps in disaccord over who would hold what post in the supposed government that they intend on establishing or that they are pitching to establish. But this is the current dynamic that we have right now. And if anything, it's a symptomatic, let's say, of the greed of the Libyan political class. Now, moving forward, there are perhaps, from my opinion, at least three different scenarios, which are currently discussed. Broadly speaking, one would be the most technically constructive one, which is effectively what UN Stephanie Williams is working on. So having a technical postponement of the elections, push them not too long, obviously, so set a new deadline, and hold the elections perhaps somewhere along January or February. And the meetings that happened in the past week with the different political figures and armed actors is essentially to get an informal agreement and garner informal traction, let's say, behind that plan. The separate plans, let's say, are far less multilateral and not even, I would say, brokered by the UN itself. One is essentially brokered by the elite that is posing now as an alternative to the GNU-PM and is spearheaded by the figures that are explicitly anti-Dbeiba. And this plan, in different permutation, essentially would want to see the government of national unity replaced, and its figures really replaced by something else. The main blockages on that front are the fact that, well, it is not something that will be endorsed, or at least at the moment, it's not something that is endorsed in a multilateral track, so it doesn't have a track of its own. These figures will also struggle to get an endorsement by the House of Representatives, because this is essentially what the plan revolves around. And third, also the de facto military division on the ground will remain a reality. So therefore, you'll continue to have this divide between East and West over things. Now, the last plan is even less multilateral and doesn't involve this wide of an array of political figures, and it's something that has been concocted or has been being concocted in Abu Dhabi and has faced setbacks, which is essentially this permutation of a power sharing deal between Abdelhamid Dbeiba on the one hand and then Khalifa Haftar on the other hand. This has faced blockages for several reasons. I would say right now the main alignment that Khalifa Haftar and Abdelhamid Dbeiba have is merely on the side of not wanting a runoff against Saif al-Islam as a potential frontrunner, basically. But these are the three rough, at this stage, different scenarios that we have, and this is what people are speaking of, and when I say people, it's not necessarily the Libyan citizens, but the political class are speaking of on the ground. Now, in terms of the situation on the ground, there hasn't been much by way of anxiety, I would say, amongst the Libyan citizens themselves. Basically, obviously, people wanted elections, but they wanted to vote. They didn't want to vote on a specific date. Basically, people didn't sign up to vote on a specific date. They signed up to vote. So a technical delay or a delay of the elections isn't something that will cause significant, I would say, tensions at the level of the population. What it might cause, however, is tensions and maneuvering at the level of not just the political class, but some of the armed groups, which have now sided, and you clearly see that not just in Tripoli, but also in different cities, I would say, which have sided with different political candidates. So they have either sided roughly with figures aligned with the GNU-PM or aligned with the political coalition that I mentioned earlier. And that is causing tensions on the ground, including what happened in Tripoli a couple of days ago, including what happened in Sabha now, essentially a territorial consolidation of Khalifa Haftar in the south to basically position himself better for a potential deal either with the coalition that is anti-Dbeiba or with Dbeiba himself. And that's why I mentioned that in these two scenarios, Khalifa Haftar is poised to benefit, because out of the three scenarios, in one, he's allowed to run for elections. In the other two, essentially the government's or power sharing deal that would come out, he would be one of the main figures included. So that's roughly the current situation. It's not very positive, but I would argue that having a technical delay of the elections instead of a manufactured crisis after people would have gone to vote for round one is perhaps better. So there's a silver lining. And if the process is to be salvaged right now, there needs to be an announcement of the modalities of the delay, and there needs to be a push to support, let's say, the multilateral track of the UN and not entertain the plans of the Libyan spoilers. And I'll leave it at that, Karim. Maybe we can talk more afterwards, basically. But I'm looking forward to hear what the others will say.
You can be sure that there is a lot to talk about this. Thank you very much, Imad. Mary?
Thank you very much, Karim, and thank you, Imad, as well. Very interesting to hear your perspective from on the ground in Libya today. As Imad has outlined, I think we could change the title of our conversation today to the longer road to elections in Libya. And this will come as little surprise to many of us. And I think yet again, we are facing into something of a cautionary tale when it comes to developments in Libya and the international handling of dynamics in Libya. One former senior international official in Libya liked to use the ambulance analogy, whereby Libya was a seriously injured or ill patient that we needed to get to the hospital. There was an ambulance available, but it had no license plates. Do we wait until we have license plates, or do we dash to the hospital immediately? That former official was himself tripped up by an ambulance without a license plate approach to Libya. And I think that the situation we find ourselves in now is yet another example of this. Prime example is what happened with the two highly disputed electoral laws that were passed in September and October that were supposed to underpin these elections, the presidential elections and the parliamentary elections. Those laws were clearly problematic on so many levels, not least the fact that they were unilaterally passed by the House of Representatives Speaker Gilles Saleh. Yet the UN SOSG, Jan Kubiš, now retired, supported them, welcomed the passage of those laws, as did other international players. And of course, while those contested laws are not the only element that has led us to the point where a week away from the planned elections, it does appear that we will hear some postponement announcements sometime soon. It was key, I think, and there's a lesson learned there. Again, beware the ambulance without a license plate approach to the Libya situation. I think also it's worth bearing in mind for those who've joined us today who are maybe not so familiar with the situation on the ground in Libya. Some reminders in terms of how, despite the ceasefire that was agreed in October 2020, how very fraught the atmosphere and environment is in Libya at present. And to give just one example of that, the organization that has been tasked with organizing Libya's first ever presidential debates, of course, these are Libya's first presidential elections, decided to hold those presidential debates remotely, because to hold them in any location in Libya would invite accusations of bias, etc. So something as simple as that Libya cannot hold presidential elections in country because we're still talking about a population, a society that is bitterly polarized after 7 years of civil conflict, despite that lasting ceasefire agreed in October 2020. But I also wanted to focus on some of the aspects to kind of bring this conversation out a little bit from the immediate situation now in terms of this expected postponement of the presidential elections, but to bring us back a little bit to the wider picture in terms of what the last year has told us, and particularly the last couple of months have told us about the appetite in Libya for elections. This, I think, is really interesting and worth parsing, because back in 2014, and I was in Libya for the 2014 elections, in the weeks leading up to those elections, I met many people in Benghazi, other parts of eastern Libya, in Tripoli, other parts of western Libya, who told me that they were not going to vote in those elections because they felt there was no point voting in a situation where the men with the guns, as many of them put it, held more power than any elected representatives. So the low turnout we saw in 2014, just over 600,000 voters compared to 1.7 million in the 2012 elections. Yes, some of that low turnout was as a result of elections being disrupted in certain parts of the country, but that was a minor element of this. It was largely a disenchantment amongst most of the Libyan population in terms of what electoral politics could actually deliver. And there were many Libyans concerned that year after those elections that Libyans were drifting away from democratic politics. And of course, that then opened up the possibility of another form of politics taking root in Libya. But what we've seen this year is, and particularly over the last couple of months, I think is fascinating in terms of the number of registered voters, but particularly the number of Libyans who have in recent weeks collected their voting cards to allow them vote in the election. 2.4 million Libyans out of 2.8 million registered voters have collected their voting cards. Now, yes, there may be, and there are already accusations or allegations of attempts at fraud when it comes to collecting voting cards, but 2.4 million Libyans collecting their voting cards with the intention to vote whenever elections are held is really significant, I think, when you compare that to 7 years ago, 600,000 Libyans turned out to vote. What does that tell us? I think it's very clear. Libyans want to vote after 7 years. They have been energized by the idea of an election sometime soon. They clearly want to clear the slate of the multiple problematic figures that have played a role in the civil conflict over the last 7 years. They want to clear the political landscape. And I think given the expected postponement of these elections, the inevitable disappointment that will come about as a result of that, the lesson learned from this, because there are many people speculating whether we might have not just a postponement of 2 or 3 months, but a longer postponement than that. So I think how you actually deal with the dashed expectations, the disappointment from those Libyans that were clearly energized to vote will be another challenge. But I think it's also worth asking whether Libyans were energized by the candidates they could actually vote for, or were they energized by their opposition to certain candidates who emerged in recent weeks. And it was interesting that we saw a spike in the collection of voting cards after certain candidates had submitted their candidacy papers. I think it's also worth bearing in mind the number of candidates that have come forward rather. Initially 98 presidential candidates, of which just over 70 it was cut down to just over 70. With the parliamentary elections, over 5,000 candidates. Again, these are signs, I think, of a population that has been energized by the elections, the idea of elections, not a population that has basically become utterly disenchanted by the idea of democratic politics. So I think these are aspects of this conversation worth noting, because they tell us something about how population dynamics, or certainly sentiment amongst the Libyan population towards the idea of elections in the future, how that may play out. And of course, that underscores the importance of holding elections in Libya under the right kind of conditions, under the right kind of laws, not laws that are contested, not laws that have become highly politicized sometime soon. And I would leave it at that. Thank you, Karim.
Thank you very much, Mary, especially for emphasizing and stressing this point, which has been one of the most disturbing things that's happened so far. I've heard on many sides, Libyans are not ready for democracy. Libyans, the people, which is absurdity in and of itself, that any people has to be ready or not ready for democracy. That's the bad. And the second one, that they were in favor of a process that would lead to, if you know, the democratic, a more pluralistic, more open and stuff. And that is very important. We said Libyans do want democracy. They do want to vote. They want to participate. They want to have a different kind of government. And the fact that they have a bad elite that emphasizes the contrary is something we at least in the West should stress and emphasize. Thank you very much for that. Imad, Ben.
Thank you, Karim. I really appreciate hosting you, participating. And particularly thank you for putting me after Ahmad and Mary, because there's no one better to explain the situation on the ground, and you're leaving me in a position where I have to add something to their excellent presentations. So I'm going to try to focus on what they didn't really cover on the international component to this story. And cutting to the chase, I think, you know, the international community is mostly complicit in this impending problem about the December 24th date. Obviously, the Libyans set that date last November when the LPDF, the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, met. But when Kubish sort of abandoned that effort in the summer and languished, the effort languished, and then he accepted Aguilar's law without any modifications and just proposed it to the Security Council, and the Security Council endorsed it. That was a tremendous mistake. Now, obviously, Kubish is out, but he made a number of other mistakes, and it's not really nice to beat on a dead man, but just it explains why and how we got there. He didn't see his role as a mediator instead of as a facilitator. The failure to invest in the LPDF. And in September, there was an effort to move him out at the UN, and the Russians made it clear that that was not going to happen. And only until Guterres, the Secretary General, made it clear and created this conflict to bring Stephanie Williams back in, were they able to adjust this plan at the last minute. So you can see the Russians behind the scenes, even interfering in this process in a chaotic way, as a motivation for their actions. And you don't have to see their overt intervention to get the sense of where they are. As far as the peace three plus Italy and Germany, their constant statements about simultaneous elections on December 24th helped create this situation. And that is sort of indefensible to me. And now they are where they are. And only the Italians, to my knowledge, raised these concerns about that Mary, I think, alluded to before about the manner in which Gila's law was passed and how it wasn't accepted by the vast majority of Libyans. Only the international community basically legitimized this by default. So, deadlines are useful for a certain extent, but we should have recognized far earlier that these deadlines were not going to be achieved. And the other main fault of the international community, and that lies, I think, primarily in the US as well, as dating back to March, we really didn't invest in the GNU as a mechanism for moving the country forward and bringing unity to it. So what to do now? I think Ahmad and Mary mentioned a few options. I would favor, and I've written this, not an indefinite postponement to the elections. Mary articulated it very well in terms of Libyans are enthusiastic to vote. They need to vote. There's a need for renewed legitimacy in this country, but not in this chaotic manner. I think the UN should be the focal point now that Stephanie Williams is back on the ground. That means we, as the United States and others, need to make sure there's not forum shopping, which is a typical way to outmaneuver mechanisms for agreements. And then there should be a clear election timeline set. I think one of Mary also alluded to that. And that should be a public mechanism, whether it's laid out by HNEC, the Elections Committee, or the UN. Accomplishments, which have already been done in terms of the distribution of electoral cards, and technical things that need to be worked out. Even basic things like observers and monitors. You can't have an election that's legitimized without a robust monitoring mechanism. Observers, foreign observers. And the fact that there were no observation missions planned, even running up to December, let alone observation missions across the country, that's only one grounds for arguments about how this election can be, if election were to proceed, how it could be challenged on all the bases. Candidates, criteria needs to be worked out. Ballots need to be printed. We haven't heard a word about the timing of the parliamentary elections. 5,000 candidates. It's crazy to think that that can be worked out in a matter of less than a week. Obviously, there needs to be significant thought into this next delicate phase of how to proceed on December 24th or December 25th, when many will argue that the GNU has expired, but Mary and Ahmad may have additional thoughts, Kareem as well. But I think in terms of the election, rescheduling it, pushing it back, we should have done this 6 months ago, or shown flexibility 6 months ago. We should have shown flexibility on this in November in Paris, but we didn't. And now we are where we are. So it's up to the UN, I think, with the support of the key allies, to set a new timeline based on specific criteria, somewhat of which I mentioned in terms of laying out candidate criteria, laying out what needs to be done to actually execute a technically well thought of election. And whether it's 3 months or 6 months, that's the delay, and that's the things that need to be worked on, and then check them off in cooperation with at HNEC. There's no reason that Ahmad Saya, as well as technically he is, should have this much put on him, his shoulders alone, to make these calls. The international community must absorb some of that political weight. Otherwise, it's going to end very poorly. So I'll stop there, and and one more point. As far as the U.S. role, obviously, we'd like to see them as active as possible. They have been active more than the previous administration. Obviously, that doesn't set up a high bar. But in terms of what we can do specifically, the U.S. should be focused on keeping the international spoilers, the traditional spoilers, out of the conflict now. And that can be done with careful, high-level diplomacy, not necessarily something that's recognized and recognizable. But that's, I think, where we can contribute the most for the time being. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, man. Very interesting. You gave me an idea for a good question to ask to the whole panel later on. But let's first go hear what Roberta has to tell us, and then we'll go back to the whole panel. Roberta, your phone.
Thanks a lot, Karim, and actually thanks a lot for putting together this very interesting panel today. If you allow me, I'd like to focus my presentation a little bit more on the SSR side of things. So, in matters of SSR, I think, it's easy to forget, given all that there is actually to do still in the country, that a lot has been attempted since the fall of Gaddafi a decade ago. And I would say that in spite of all of that, to this day, a clear definition of what security sector reform is and what it should be in Libya is absent still from the security track, which of course has impacts on the electoral process as a whole. For example, I would say that this plays a large part in the fact that elections have been weaponized and, they've been ultimately subjected to what has been a fundamentally flawed process. So elections at this stage in and of themselves have very few chances of actually becoming a vehicle through which the country will be reformed, let alone fixed. And, I would say that with the elections, potential still postponement, even though very uncertain for now, there might, however, be an opportunity to set at least parts of the process back on track in terms of sustainability. What I've been able to, observe through my work is that the fundamental pillars of holistic security sector reform are not at any stage of the process spelled out in plans or visions that, would tend to be developed as part of national strategies or peace agreements. So, just to give an example, oversight, be it parliamentary or independent, is rarely put on the discussion table, even though civilian oversight is actually a key component of democratic rule of law. So it's something that can't just be brought about through elections alone, given that the necessary structures for it don't exist. So, you're going to have, largely inactive parliamentary committees that yield very little influence, be it in the East or the West. You're going to have on the independent end of the oversight spectrum some anti-corruption agencies whose own independence is questionable, but there's not really much in place beyond that. Another example is that while work in the area of security sector governance, it includes some aspects of state building, but there's a fundamental timeline problem that underpins that, because you have dual legal frameworks and corresponding security sector laws that can only be hoped to be reconciled in the long term. So again, elections alone won't fix this, since I would say unity can't be a byproduct of what is fundamentally a flawed electoral process. So, the absence of a nationwide agreeable legal framework will, in my opinion, continue to be an obstacle to meaningful institutional reform pre, post, during elections. I mentioned these examples because they are two of a myriad that show that there are just some fundamental governance crises in Libya, which elections won't solve, even if they take place in an ideal setting, which is very unlikely, with outcomes that are accepted and recognized by all. Part of the reason why is, as mentioned by other speakers, there's a lack of a constitutional basis. There are flawed electoral laws, and among other things, that affects the recognition, for example, of roles and responsibilities of governmental institutions and all the related questions around the separation of powers between the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. So I would say, in short, elections, they're a piece of the broader puzzle. They're not the whole puzzle as they've made out to be in many instances. I do think that, right now we're at a sort of critical juncture in which it's important for the international community to really take stock of the successes and perhaps more importantly, the failures over the past decade, and really put some thought in recalibrating and rethinking their approach to the Libyan context. One of the elements, here is, of course, the need to really maintain and strengthen a form of international cohesion, which is primordial if the international community wants to play a role in managing adherence in general, so adherence to the electoral roadmap, adherence to commitment on interim security arrangements, and adherence to a transitional justice process. So, I would say, there was a lot of projected cohesion on elections these past few months, but it really needs to go beyond the political messaging. I want to emphasize that it needs to be values-driven, and above all, it needs to be focused on preventing spoiling of the process as a whole. Another element that, I think more attention needs to be paid to the substance itself of international roadmaps. So this naturally entails the need for internationals to support and contribute to a locally owned process that has to be specifically meant to create national strategies, visions for security sector reform, and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, and this both in the medium and the long term. So alongside, putting some pressure, but also supporting Libyan actors to articulate somehow a workable vision and then act on it, I really think that also at the same time, international actors can and should begin to help with, stabilizing projects in the security sphere that go a lot beyond just train and equip, and that should be focused on, trying to build up either new or definitely unified national services, or at least a national framework for security provision. I would say that, that's where you have, that's where you see the importance of having a vision and a long-term strategy, because when you have those, these realistic kind of short-term milestones, they can be defined, and then they can be adapted really to the context. So at that point, what you'll have is that regardless of the changes that the Libyan context will undoubtedly experience, you, in theory, would have something solid and something constructive that the international community can build on in order to contribute to achieving sustainable peace in the long run. Maybe just a few last points from me before I hand the floor back. I think that none of these steps can be, can happen without the launch of a reconciliation process, of which elections are actually just a very small component, especially when the integrity and the fairness of the electoral process has been so degraded as it is now. So, after a decade of civil war and a lot of failed instances of governance, Libya really needs reconciliation, because in fact, if any new political platform is, to be truly stabilizing, then a reconciliation process is for me a key requisite of that. However, and I really want to caveat this, given that all of Libya's current political bodies are conflict actors in one way or another, I do still think that there is a need for outside assistance if you want to have a true kind of people-centric and effective reconciliation process. This is something that's often been dismissed and sidelined by international and sometimes even by national actors. But I really think that it could be an important part of any future policy to stabilize Libya that's formulated by the international community. And maybe I'd just like to end my presentation on the fact that I really do think that there are many lessons learned from other contexts when it comes to all of these elements, which are, quite complex. And that the international community can, in my opinion, provide some support to Libyan actors, be it, in the short term in terms of confidence building, or in the long term in terms of things like transitional justice. But this is only provided that they adopt a cohesive position on adherence to any roadmap that ends up being established in this context and for this process, and that they truly insist on the need to ensure transition towards true rule of law and democratic governance as well. I'll leave it to you.
Thank you very much, Roberta. And let me tell you that your presentation in particular, and also the others, has really raised, we really have to tackle this bull by the horns. They show the international community. There is no such a thing. We have been seeing the ambiguity of most of the international actors in such a way that is almost mind-boggling how we have the courage of still talking about an international community. Why do we still talk about the United Nations? Why do we still talk about a US siding for a transition when we have the net perception of the Libyans of a person, of the special envoy like Norland, doing something but doing something else by taking sides and opening up to that to Khalifa Haftar and this vision and his positions. When we have France that says one thing and does the opposite. When we have the United Arab Emirates and Egypt who recreated after his defeat the President Haftar and brought him back to the center of the attention as knowing that he would be the main spoiler of the whole process. So what I'm asking to all of you in a 1 minute reply as a general question is, how could we even think, even hope that things change in Libya when we know that for the foreigner influence is so much, so powerful, and it is so divided and so contradictory with each other, and so in contrast with what they say and what their real interests are, with the fact that they refuse to act openly upon what they say openly, that is, intervene militarily, economically, diplomatically, whatever in the way to do what they say they want to do, but they have the courage to do that diplomatically, militarily, politically, in every other way, to spoil the system and push their own faction to the center of the stage and play their own interest. Let's go along the order with Imad first, and then Mary and Ben.
Okay, well, I have the difficult task of trying to respond to that. That's the kind of $1 million question. The problem is, I mean, interventionism is a de facto reality, but what we have now and what we've had particularly, I would say, since the past year is you've literally given the steering wheel to the spoilers, had this choreography. I don't know if it partly was naivete. Speaking to diplomats, it was definitely partly naivete, and I would actually definitely put the US in that basket. The foreign policy of the US has been driven by a really naive perception in the past year, at least in terms of their expectations vis-a-vis elections, basically. But basically, you've given the steering wheel to spoilers. You've believed whatever they told you about these sudden democratic bursts of beliefs that they had. And now that they're going back on their word, they're selecting parts of the roadmap they prefer to see happen or not to see happen. You are trying to again entertain that, and that needs to stop. If the current process as it is, with not even speaking about the issue of foreign interventionism writ large, but if the current process is to be salvaged, that dynamic of appeasement needs to stop. It's ridiculous that you have the major architects of the legitimacy crisis of 2014, 15, 16, not just protagonists of this one, but literally, and not just, but actually the main interlocutors that you have for spearheading the contemporary process. You've endorsed a law that is unilaterally architected by a main spoiler. You're entertaining the sudden democratic aspirations of a guy that literally launched the war and humiliated the UN in the process. And you're leaving 2.5 million Libyans that signed up to vote, largely out of desperation, not out of optimism. You're leaving them just without any other option but to vote for, I would say, 3 candidates, all of which have a dishonorable track record, basically. So if that cycle is to be broken without even tackling the issue of foreign interventions writ large, you need to stop the cycle of appeasement vis-a-vis this process in particular. After that, we can talk about rebuilding on the Berlin process. We can talk about what went wrong after that. We can talk about, well, the issue of foreign mercenaries, etc. But at least in terms of this current contemporary dynamic and the catch-22 that this political elite is gaslighting 2.5 million Libyans with, this dynamic needs to stop being entertained by the internationals. Because if that doesn't stop, and if they're allowed to drive the process beyond the 24th of December, it's not going to lead anywhere positive. I'll leave it at that. That's my Libya rant.
Perfect. It's excellent. I agree with you 100%. Mary?
Well, as Imad was just outlining, since November 2020, which is when the decision was made to have elections on December 24th, 2021, the initial plan was to have presidential and parliamentary elections on the same day. Over the last year, that date has become something of a holy grail, this focal point for everything that happens politically in Libya, the international focus on December 24th, in a way that was quite striking, that there was very little discussion, very little thought, it appeared, as to what happened the day after. What would Libya look like on December 25th if elections were to take place on that date? So I think that caused also a certain ultimately harmful dynamic, where when you fixate on a date and a goal on that date, then you basically put up tripwires for yourself in terms of the momentum towards that date. And I think that's the situation that we now find ourselves in. From a European perspective, it's been very interesting to see how, as we all know, the Europeans have been battling for relevance since Haftar's failed Tripoli offensive, during which, of course, Russia came in as a major player on the side of Haftar. Turkey came in as a major player on the side of the anti-Haftar forces, leaving the Europeans really on the sidelines, because the Europeans were unable to basically bring about a unified position on that failed Tripoli offensive by Haftar. We have seen, of course, the French and the Italians saying that they have moved closer together in their positions. They're now singing from the same hymn sheet. Others are more skeptical of those claims. But I think, what's key here is Turkey and Russia still as the 2 main external power brokers inside Libya. And what has been really interesting over the last week or two, we've seen how internationals have quietly dropped references to December 24th as a date for elections in their statements and their public pronouncements. We see references now to elections being held in a timely manner, etc. So there has been a very, very noticeable slippage in language. But what was interesting earlier this week, the Russian foreign minister, he said that Moscow would have no problem with a delay in elections if that meant that elections could happen in an effective manner that would lead to further stabilization, etc. So, in fact, Russia is the only international player so far who has come out and said, look, there may be a delay and we wouldn't have a problem with the delay. And I think that's really striking.
Indeed. Ben?
I can't add much, I think, other than I think I'll echo what Ahmad said in terms of the whole process relying on the same actors and the same spoilers as 2014 and 2015. And we mentioned a lot of Haftar, but not as much on Aguila, who wrote the law. And Aguila is, he's been sanctioned since 2015 in the US. And the fact that we're focused on so much of the diplomacy related to a sanctioned actor just shows the sort of backwardness of not trying to rely on the old guard. So I think what UNSMIL was trying to do under Stephanie and Ghassan Saleh was to go outside the box with the LPDF. When that failed, not of their doing, but of their successors' doing. And of course, the US blames Debeba for that process because of the manner in which he was elected. But they dismissed that whole process and went back to the old hat. And that has led us to the situation we are in now. I don't think that's necessarily a useful contribution, but just to clarify and echo my colleagues. The irony of the international role, I think, is on the one hand, the politics are stalemated, but on the other hand, because of the Turkish presence, maybe the Russian presence on the other side, the military situation is relatively stable. Obviously, there are clashes and things could escalate at any point. But the Turkish presence is a significant deterrent against another invasion or something, the worst case from Haftar. So when he threatens to launch an invasion again, if elections are delayed, I think you have to take that somewhat with a grain of salt. And that reopens the possibility of diplomacy. And now we have someone on the ground in terms of Stephanie who can really have hard conversations with the actors and get this boat back on track. That's not an easy task. She should have been in there on the ground way earlier, or a new SRSG could have been appointed in September, but we are where we are, and she needs the full support the US and other actors who have not been as helpful as they could have been.
Thank you very much, Ron. Roberta, do you want to add something?
I mean, it's always hard to come in last on these types of questions, but maybe I'll just probe a thought and see where that leads. As Imad, Mary, and Ben were talking, I was thinking about the fact that we don't really have a process for international accountability in the case of Libya. So there are supposed to be mechanisms that are supposed to hold the international community somehow accountable, especially when they get involved in foreign territories and start pushing their own priorities over due process and things like that. And I haven't really seen any attention being paid to the accountability of foreign actors in Libya, and definitely not to the same degree as the kind of narrative emphasis that's being put on the accountability of Libyan actors. So, just probing a thought out there about whether there actually could be any way in which we could, start talking a little bit about international responsibility and accountability in this context.
Thank you very much, Roberta. Now, I will read the first 3 or 4 questions that I've received, and then each one of you decides which one you prefer to pick. From Ambassador Peter Millet, he says, the international community has often made statements threatening sanctions against the spoilers. Is this a realistic threat? And if so, how should it be deployed? Fawzi Al-Madani, December 24th, first round. After December 24, who will be government caretaker? When we have someone like Fathi Bashaga giving the Debeba ultimatum to leave by midnight December 24, it seems it wasn't thought through. I think what he's asking is, given this situation, what's going to happen really after December 24? Are we going to have the same situation, or would there be a change? Monica Marks asks, what does the UAE hope to achieve in Libya's upcoming elections? Is its support for Haftar diminishing? And then, has the breakdown of democracy in neighboring Tunisia impacted this current situation in Libya? Would you like to begin answer some of these questions?
I'm happy to jump in there, Karim, and respond to Monica's questions. First of all, about the UAE's hopes in the upcoming elections and its whether its support for Haftar is diminishing. The UAE, publicly at least, has basically been singing the same tune as the other internationals in terms of supporting the idea of elections on December 24th and the UN roadmap. I think in terms of its stance on Haftar, we have seen since Haftar's failed Tripoli offensive, some of his external backers become somewhat more lukewarm towards him, because essentially he has been left quite exposed in terms of his ability to deliver on what he has promised in many respects. And also there is a sense that Haftar would really struggle to win a national election. Haftar, of course, is one of the candidates for the presidential elections. Polling, with all the caveats we're all aware of when it comes to public opinion polling in Libya, polling has shown that Haftar is really trailing behind the current Prime Minister Abdelhamid Dbeibeh and Saif al-Islam Gaddafi as potential presidential candidates. I was in Tripoli in October, and it was very, very evident that the scars, the wounds of Haftar's failed Tripoli offensive, which sparked a war that lasted over a year, that the scars of that war are still very fresh. The anger about that war and the offensive that Haftar launched is still very live. And that kind of underscores this idea that Haftar would really struggle to win a national election in Libya, bearing in mind that the majority of Libya's population is in the capital Tripoli and Western Libya. So I'm sure that those realities are playing a role in terms of Emirati considerations right now. Monica's second question regarding whether the breakdown of democracy in neighboring Tunisia has impacted the current situation in Libya. What was really interesting when the sudden developments occurred in Tunisia several months ago was immediately there was a reaction in Libya, in the sense of several members of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum publicly said that what was happening in Tunisia showed the real risks of a presidential system without a very strong constitutional framework. And of course, Libya is missing that strong constitutional framework. This is one of the serious reservations that Libyans have about a presidential system in an environment like you have in Libya right now, without the proper checks and balances that a proper constitution would provide. So yes, what has happened in Tunisia has impacted the conversation in Libya about the way forward. It has basically underscored the concerns of those who are already wary of a presidential system in the current environment, in the current context, not to mention, of course, the legacy of the Gaddafi era.
Thank you very much. Does anyone want to recap the question about the sanctions, international sanctions that have been threatened, and how realistic is the threat?
I'll take the question on sanctions. Sanctions have been, they haven't been really leveraged seriously. Even Aguila's sanctions have been lifted when it became expedient to lift them, which I would say has significantly weakened the credibility of sanctions. There needs to be a rethinking about who would actually be hurt by sanctions, when to leverage them, and on whom and on what basis to leverage them. And that basis has clearly not been consistent if we look at who has received sanctions in the past 10 years in Libya, or particularly at least in the last 5. And also there needs to be a redefinition of what we consider a spoiler, because what we might consider a spoiler to the process is clearly very different to what certain states involved in the sanctioning process might consider a spoiler. That's aside the fact that imposing sanctions is generally a multilateral exercise, and there are vast divisions within Europe, at least, on who to sanction, basically. And I know for a fact that in certain cases, 2 at least of the European states have been very vocal in their disapproval of sanctions being imposed on some political figures basically for their spoiling. And that has also decredibilized the threat of sanctions in Libya. So if that is to change, there needs to be, we need to address this issue of foreign influence and build on what Ghassam essentially did with the Berlin conference, and that there needs to be an agreement amongst the international kind of side of things to actually spearhead that sanctioning process forward.
Can I add one word about that as well? So I mentioned Avila is still under sanctions. You can argue that he doesn't, in the US, obviously it was lifted in Europe, and you can argue it's not a factor for him because of assets. If we were going to ever sanction Haftar, the US, that is, and his property and it's here, that would be more effective. But if we didn't do that in an active conflict situation, you can imagine that we're not going to do it in a political dispute unless he does something incredibly stupid about. And then there's Saif al-Islam, who's actively wanted by the ICC. And they made another statement about Libya's responsibility to hand him over. And that, I guess, has, among other things, limited his public visibility during this campaign. That's another crazy situation that needs to be worked out. Obviously, he has his supporters and detractors. Mary, I think, alluded to the polling and why he receives so much support. What's disheartening is not only the support that he receives from former regime members, but youth who are disheartened of the last 10 years and have been actually experienced the Gaddafi era and the prospects of him gaining votes beyond the Greens is extremely worrisome, and can imagine the circumstances if he actually won something. And obviously that gets reiterates the issue about candidacy requirements, and even the Electoral Commission has filed legal cases against him, and that has just highlighted, we didn't, among other things, we didn't address the judicial process and how broken it is. But that's a nightmare situation for the international community, let alone this dilemma of elections themselves.
Yes, very well, Ben. There's another question. It says, addressed to you. It says, okay, here it is. Ben, what and how would change once elections are postponed? Will the current state of affairs look differently in 6 months? Which will...
I mean, that's the dilemma. And the argument was, for those who were opposed to delaying them, that the risk of delay was greater than the risk of holding them on time. I thought that was frankly nonsensical. But it all matters about how you manage the delay. And it could look very different. It could look the same. It could look worse. And some of the stuff I proposed in terms of how you manage the delay, technically based, having a specific agenda about what steps need to be taken. Obviously, it's not just a technical issue, it's a very political issue, but these need to be compromised and mediated. And I stress the word mediated because that was the role of the UN before, and it hasn't been the role of the UN since a few days ago when Stephanie came back.
Thank you very much, man. Mary, something? Yes, man, go ahead. No, go ahead, man.
No, I just wanted to say about the delay, basically, and I mean, ideally, what would be constructive is announces a technical delay. The only problem with that is that a technical delay is irreconcilable with touching certain things related to the process, basically. So ideally, the three areas, let's say, that would, in an ideal world, be reconsidered is one, the presidential requirements. So what is actually required for a president to be able to submit a candidacy, and these rules need to be enforced, not particular, issues around nationality, etc. Those need to be resolved. So you need to apply the same standards to all the candidates on that front. And we clearly know that that hasn't been applied. So that's one. Secondly, you need to redefine basically what the legal framework, I would say, for the entire electoral process is. So what the relationship of the executive or the legislature is with the new president, basically. So that needs to also be revised, because right now we have I wouldn't even call it a presidential system. It's a winner takes all presidency with perhaps parliamentary elections at some point, unclear what parliament would do, unclear what the president would do. But you clearly see that there are 90 candidates that rushed to get a spot at the presidency because it was an unchecked, basically, power. It was an unchecked access to power. So that needs to be amended. And then the last area that also needs to be amended is the sequencing of things. And people expediently kind of didn't tackle that decision, despite the fact that it absolutely made no sense. Even the Paris conference absolutely made no sense. The whole idea of an electoral process that would start on the 24th with election held then, and potentially a round two that would be simultaneous with parliamentary election, didn't make sense. Why? Because it didn't acknowledge the possibility that a participant could get 50+1 in all areas, which would manufacture a legitimacy crisis right away, purely based on the laws that existed. That's aside, the jockeying that would happen after round one, but purely conceptually, that was just a flaw in the law in and of itself, and made the process entirely illegitimate starting on the 25th of December. So these three areas need to be retackled. I think there will be a problem tackling, for Stephanie and for the HNIC, tackling the presidential requirements, but they can definitely revisit the law, reestablish the system in a way where the presidency, it's not just a rush towards the presidency, and the president isn't just a new authoritarian, basically. And then the sequencing of things, basically, because the room for delay allows for that. However, in terms of who is and isn't allowed to run, that's going to be a problem. That's been left to the judiciary. You clearly see that Aguila Saleh has now also tried to appoint his own Supreme Judicial Council, and that's to preempt basically the process from being actually steered in a way that is constructive. And these are the two areas that I would recommend basically actually revisiting based on the technical delay that is bound to occur. Now, again, the HNIC is very reticent to announce a delay itself, so it needs international support to be able to do that, to be able to justify it, etc. So, yeah. You're muted, Karim.
Okay, so that I'm mute. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. There is another question by Monica Marks directly for Mary. Mary, your comments stress that the Libyans are energized to vote, to participate in the democratic process, and are eager to move beyond the country's sclerotic political elites. How does that square with the seemingly popularity of all the regime, quite authoritarian candidates like Saif Islam and Haftar? It's a very interesting question.
It is indeed a very interesting question. Thank you, Monica. What I would say is that I would return to the point I made earlier in that Libyans seem to be energized to vote, both in terms of candidates they really would like to see as president in Libya, but also energized to vote in order to prevent certain candidates from becoming president. So if we go back to that very sudden and significant uptick in the number of voting cards being collected over a couple of days last month, it happened in the days between Saif al-Islam Gaddafi submitting his candidacy papers, and then a couple of days later, Khalifa Haftar submitting his candidacy papers. Of course, we can't be sure, but the uptick in people collecting their voting cards would suggest either masses of people desperately wanted to vote in order to see Saif al-Islam Gaddafi elected, or to prevent him from being elected, and the same with Khalifa Haftar. I think it's very interesting if we look at the three front runners rather, at least according to the caveated polling we've all been citing. They are Abdelhamid Dbeibah, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, and Khalifa Haftar, all very controversial in their own way, and all of them lightning rods to particular constituencies in Libya. So I think that this election, whenever it takes place, if those three candidates are the front runners, you will see a significant proportion of Libyans voting to keep them out, as opposed to voting for a particular candidate because they believe in the vision that that candidate has presented. That said, I think it's worth noting that we haven't really seen anything much from most of the candidates in terms of their manifestos, in terms of their vision for what their presidency would look like in that. And I think that that's telling in itself. I think it's also worth bearing in mind, going back to what I said earlier about basically this kind of urge in Libya right now to kind of clear the political slate, to have a whole new political landscape. If we look at the 98 initial candidates for the presidential elections, rather, which were later whittled down to just over 70, it was very, very striking that there are so many familiar faces on that list, whether they're former prime ministers from over the past decade, former government ministers, and other figures, many of them controversial, many of them who have played a role in the civil conflict since 2014, and many of the political machinations that led to that civil conflict in the years before that. So for ever how much Libyans, ordinary Libyans, might want, a clean slate going forward, a clean political slate, it is interesting that you still have a lot of those old faces that many blame for the ills of the last decade trying their chances in a future election.
Thank you very much, Mary. There is another question by an old friend, Gala Abu Zakuk. This is, I think, for the whole panel. Two packet questions. First, who and or what entity is responsible for announcing the delay of the elections? What needs to be outlined and further prepared to allow for a viable electoral process? That's the first question. The second question, who are the serious contenders for the presidential elections? Is it between Dbeibah and Haftar? Is there an opportunity for other candidates to come to the fore, or will these elections ultimately repurpose the existing political players? That is, whoever wants to pick up on this and the others comment.
I think Mary just answered the part about the front runners. I just added, and we'll see what happens in the next few days about who is responsible. I alluded in the introductory remarks I made. Ahmad Saya has immense responsibility on his hands, and well beyond the typical role of the technical election commission head, because no one else wants to seize that role. And if the election is delayed, he obviously plays a role in terms of how what he can't do physically. He can't print a ballot without knowing who's on it. He can't print a ballot of 5,000 names in 13 or whatever the districts are and the sub-districts in time. But the overall delay, I think, the political announcement should occur from UNSMIL, because UNSMIL was responsible for setting the date of the 24th. It came from an UNSMIL body. And that sort of alleviates some of the pressure on, should alleviate some of the pressure on HNEC. That's my view, and others may have other thoughts or different opinions.
Anyone has other comments before concluding?
Yes, Karim, I would like to come in and just make a couple of points about, whatever happens over the next weeks, months, Libya will be facing into a new political landscape sometime soon with new faces, and something that will be quite different from 2012 and 2014, the two previous elections that Libya has experienced in the post-Gaddafi era, is the role of the so-called Greens. We've mentioned Saif al-Islam Gaddafi. Ben has mentioned the Green current more generally, briefly earlier on. But we know that the so-called Green current, and it's, we all know, not a cohesive current. There are rivalries within that current. For those of you who are not familiar with the expression, the Green current refers to those who were either part of the Gaddafi regime or supporters or sympathizers of the regime. We know that there are several individuals in the current interim government in Tripoli who have a history with the former regime. We know that there are political parties organizing to run candidates in the parliamentary elections that are part of the Green current. So I think it's worth bearing in mind that whatever new political landscape we may see at some point next year, it will for sure include quite a cohort. It looks like a significant cohort of the so-called Greens. And I think that raises all kinds of interesting questions in terms of Libya's future. Questions including, and Roberta mentioned earlier, national reconciliation, for example. We haven't really seen a proper national reconciliation process in Libya over the last 10 years. There have been efforts, piecemeal at best, but nothing that has really gained a significant momentum. I think the question of what role the Greens may play when they become a more significant political force than they have been up to this point, a more overt force, if you like, and presence in Libyan political life, that raises all kinds of interesting questions and for sure challenges.
Karim, maybe just quickly, if I may build
yes,
on that.
I'd like to give to each one of you 2-3 minutes to conclude and sum up your thoughts. So go ahead, Roberta.
Yeah, actually, just wanted to build quickly on what Mary said, and also on part of the question which was posed, which was, what should there be to have, a fairer electoral process? And I would just, say that, yes, there is a process of national reconciliation that I was saying before needs to happen. But again, just wanted to put a very specific policy emphasis on the fact that there isn't right now a plan for the separation of powers in Libya post-elections. And that I think that as the process moves forward, this is going to be more and more something that has to be, really reckoned with. Because as Imad was saying before, if you have so many candidates rushing towards the position of president just because it's a very unchecked type of executive power, then you also need to reckon with the fact that the legislative part is still very much divided, that the judiciary is still very ineffective, and that until you have a really strong plan to bring all three together into a governance system that, may not necessarily meet all of the international standards that you expect it to, but at least has some sort of checks and balances imposed on it, I really don't think that these elections are actually going to create a form of unity and a form of stability that a lot of people that are trying to push for them really want them to have.
Imad, would you like to conclude, you and Ben?
Sure, I'll let Ben go first.
Yeah, go first.
Gee, thanks. I was going to key off of you. Let's see. I think we touched everything, although it's, so complicated what the next stages are. I'm going to quote Mary from a previous panel in terms of you hold a discussion on Libya one day and it can be totally different the next day. I think you said that. And we'll see over the next several days. One thing I think everyone can agree on, at least government officials, is they don't have to follow elections on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, if indeed there's going to be a way. But seriously, I think we all need to step back and rethink what the process needs to be going forward. There need to be clear warnings to the internal spoilers and the external spoilers from all sides. The US, the UN, Qasem Soleimani was, I can't remember, maybe it was the Med dialogue he was speaking at, where he said, this is the role of what I used to do, talking to the militias all the time, daily, to get the sense of where they were standing and warn them what was possible and not possible. That is the role of UNSMIL, and you saw that in the last 2 days by Stephanie. Instead of working in Tripoli and Benghazi, she went to Misrata and CERT. Very smart moves, I think, to figure out the security situation on the day after. I mentioned before, you can argue whether the Turkish military presence is justified or legal, but the fact that they're there, I think, is a deterrent. I don't think there's no justification for the mercenaries staying, especially the Russians. That's a huge strategic problem for the US. It should be for Europe and NATO as well. And we don't spend enough time talking about that in terms of why it's an important aspect of why the US should maintain involvement in Libya. So I'll stop there and let Imad conclude with any wise comments that we haven't touched on.
Yes, let's have Imad conclude, and then if maybe Roberta wants to say the last two words, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to say, but to just emphasize the fact that despite all these flaws in the process, despite the fact that there aren't even banners for campaign, basically, despite the fact that Libyans have literally become an afterthought in their own election, you still have 2.5 million people that went and picked up their voter card. So it's almost miraculous that after 10 years and having been through what they've been through and what we've been through, because I've also been through it, technically speaking, we still want to vote, basically. The only problem is right now the vote, well, whatever the vote was going to be on the 24th of December was just going to, at best, recycle the elite, at worst, throw us into another legitimacy crisis that would have decredibilized not just the concept of a vote, but all of the institutions that would effectively be involved in spearheading a vote, from the Libyan judiciary to the technical ECHNEC to the UN, and all that. All we would have been left with were the foreign interveners, effectively, to prey on the whatever is left of the political process and of Libyans' aspiration. So it's good that we still have 2.5 million people today that still want to vote. The only problem is we need to revisit basically what went wrong in the past year, and we need to really analyze who was actually pushing for the right type of vote, for a right process that matched the aspirations of those 2.5 million Libyan people, and those that were actually manufacturing a crisis, or at best trying to co-opt their grievances to catapult themselves into new authoritarians, basically. That needs to happen really quickly because we don't have time. And even right now, the time is ticking in the next 6 or 7 days to announce the modalities of the postponement. If the postponement's modalities are not announced, the same spoilers that manufactured this crisis they already are positioning themselves to benefit from it. It's all they wanted. That's part of the reason why they didn't campaign in the past year. No one has spoken to Libyans about anything as to what their program is. There are very few candidates that did very little campaigning in Libya, Some even just flew in, handed in their presidency papers, and left, and didn't bother with any campaigning. At best, they spoke on an elitist platform on Clubhouse to a few Libyans, and that's about it. So the whole process is ridiculous, has been ridiculous. It's about time. I'm hoping this will be a wake-up call to actually try and steer it into the right direction. And that's that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Imad. Thanks to all of you. On this sobering note, but still full of hope and realism and the resilience for what are the values of the revolution, the values that for which many people died in the revolt against the old regime. We conclude this extremely interesting event. I would like to thank all of you, our panelists, the organization of the Atlantic Council, and all of you who have stayed with us. So I'd like to thank you and hope to see you again in one of our other events. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.